It's 9:30 p.m.
Hey, what? Hey folks, I have no idea if you can hear me. I have no idea if this is working. But we'll see what happens. I don't know what I'm doing with this. So just, can you hear me? I got everything. Looks like it should be working. All right. I got how many people? Six people. Thanks everybody for joining. I've never done anything like this. Never done a live stream before. But there's so much happening. There's so much happening this week with all of that stuff around that abstract. Oh, great. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I am glad to be doing this. I wanted to do this for a while, and then I just thought this week people had been asking me lots and lots of questions about so many things with respect to the abstract, and what's an abstract, why is a conference abstract different from a paper, how does that all work? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happened there. So yeah, anybody who has a question, just lay a question in there. I mean, there's not so many of us here, so just lay a question. Actually, there's a question that came up beforehand. Let me see. Let me try one of the things I tried. I got. Let's see if this works. Yeah, that should be working. Do I think that COVID was predominantly a pandemic of the obese? No. I mean, certainly obesity is a risk factor. It's a major risk factor, but plenty of non-obese people have died, have gotten ill. There are lots of other risk factors. Like any disease, there's lots and lots of risk factors. I'm not, a medical doctor, but it's clear. My mother's best friend died, and while she was elderly, she was certainly not obese. And yeah, I know some people who got pretty sick, and they range. So yeah, no, that's not how I see it. I mean, I see it as something that we're going to be living with in some respects for the rest of our lives. It's an open question of, how, exactly what that'll look like. We don't know, right? Nobody knows. There's a question that came up on Twitter, which was really interesting. Basically, people don't know what a poster is. So if I thought maybe I would just kind of explain what what it means by a conference abstract, and actually what happened today with so Dr. Mobeen took down his earlier video, then he put up a new video, a live stream, which I saw live, and he said, well, the paper was withdrawn because it was terrible. That was how he put it, but the truth is it wasn't withdrawn. So it was never a paper. It was just never a paper. So there was a meeting, right, last July, and Yakov and his advisor and some people had done this work, and they decided to put it out at a meeting. And at a meeting like that, they're often working meetings. So people have stuff that's kind of work in progress. They want to get feedback. Meetings vary in terms of whether things become papers or not. And in a lot of meetings, they don't become papers. I've certainly presented posters or talks at meetings that have never become papers. And sometimes it's to get feedback. There's a whole series of meetings, great meetings in the U.S., typically in the Northeast, called Gordon conferences. And those meetings are often held in the summer, and they're held at like boarding school campuses and small colleges, and people stay in dorms and eat college food. And at those conferences, they're really focused on topics. And there's actually, or there was, I don't know, I haven't lived in the U.S. for 17 years, but there was kind of a, what happens at a Gordon conference stays at a Gordon conference attitude. You didn't cite things at Gordon conferences. There weren't abstract books published even at the, even for people going to the conference, they didn't have that, they didn't take that home with them. And the whole point was so people could go and discuss freely and be able to advance their work with people who shared their research interests. Now, so he did the conference. They eventually, as the flaws became more apparent to them, they withdrew. They didn't withdraw the paper, but they withdrew the draft manuscript that they had circulated to a couple of journals. So there was no paper. There was no paper to withdraw. And so there's this idea. It came up on Dr. Mobeen's channel, and I think it just misunderstands the whole thing. Like somehow that they had an obligation to tell the world that their abstract was not going to turn into a paper. And I can't even imagine the circumstances under which that would be the case. So it's just, it's so strange to have that happen. People just shouldn't take conference posters and turn them into, they shouldn't take conference posters and turn them into stuff like that. They shouldn't. You shouldn't amplify it. Like, it's just terrible. Eric, thank you. It's very nice of you. I'm not seeing your chat in my you're seeing my super chat for some reason. I don't know why. What can I do about this? Yeah, do I still consider masks effective? Absolutely. Okay, so Eric raises it. I wish I could see. I'm not sure what's going on here, why this is not. Let me restart this thing. Oh, man. Okay, now I'm stuck. So I guess I'll read Eric's question. Do you still consider masks effective? My province in Canada will be moving mask requirements. Yeah, certainly masks are effective. There's a lot of data on that. There was actually just, there have been a number of papers published even just recently that make it very clear that that masks work to reduce infection rates, infection transmission. Yeah, very clear on that. There was literally a discussion after I had set up this this live stream, but before it started, I was on Twitter, and there was a discussion about some recent papers on exactly this topic. Yeah, certainly masks work. We still wear masks in Singapore everywhere. I can't even imagine the circumstance when I would go onto the subway and not wear a mask. Oh, what type of mask? Yeah, certainly you would want not a cloth mask, right? You wouldn't want to wear a cloth mask. So you'd want to wear a non-woven fabric mask. Actually, when people, if you remember 2 years ago, people were like making masks at home for hospitals. I actually did that. I made a bunch of masks for myself and for my kids. And so I borrowed a sewing machine and I made some masks. And when I made those masks, I got a pattern from a group that was making masks for hospitals in New Jersey, and they actually also, a scientist in Georgia had posted a mask where what she had done was put a little pocket in it, and then she had added panty liners. Basically, put a panty liner in, and the idea is that even if the mask is cloth, the panty liner inside the mask was a non-woven fabric, and that would function like the non-woven fabric in surgical masks, for example. Let me see if I can reset up this Twidget. I'm not sure what is happening here. I gotta just give me 1 minute for that. Where is my... I still have the URL. I do have the URL. Okay. Now they're coming in. Okay. So, and thank you, Eric. Thanks so very much. It's very kind of you. Why? Oh, man, Alan. So why has Pharma been seemingly slow in producing tailored vaccines, especially given that several are platform-based? I'm assuming you're referring mostly to the mRNA vaccines. and those platform-based. I would hope that there will be much more rapid development of mRNA vaccine variants, because I think we'll be kind of chasing this for a while. I mean, the vaccines, so I think people are concerned about the vaccine effectiveness waning. It does wane, obviously, but there's still a lot of protection from hospitalization and death. I'm not a clinician, but so if you spend time on TWIV this week in virology, Vincent, Naomi, and the clinical, it's just very clear that the vaccinations still are effective for hospitalization, severe disease, and death. And I would certainly like to see more tailored vaccines for variants and for things like dengue and many other things. But the technology is still advancing pretty rapidly. Do you know if there's a good blog or a document combating pandemic misinformation? One of the best people on this is Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, who actually there are a number of people who are trying. It's a tough battle, right? But Gideon is really good at this. He has a Medium blog, a site at Medium, GitMK or Health Nerd on Twitter. It's at GitMK Health Nerd on Twitter, and he has great stuff on it. There's actually quite a lot of people on Twitter who are pushing back against a lot of pandemic misinformation. Quite a number. Git has his blog, actually quite a number of blogs, not so many on YouTube, right? So I kind of got into this on YouTube because I don't think there's, basically I was pulled into it because a friend of mine had been influenced by pandemic misinformation, and I was working with her, and then she got vaccinated, and then I started thinking about, what I could do to work with other people. The limitations of abstracts. If anybody is interested, I would so encourage you to read this book called The Misinformation Age. It's by two philosophers of science at University of California, Irvine. It's very readable. And they use agent-based computer modeling to model different scenarios of misinformation spread, how false beliefs spread. And there are many, many interesting things in that book, but one of the things that's really very interesting is there are a number of ways where people don't have to be malevolent scientists in order for false beliefs to spread. If there are people who are, grifters or polemicists, they can use even legitimate science, small studies where different results come out in different ways. And if you take a small study or an abstract and just amplify it to a couple of million people, it has a huge influence on how people think. Oh, so this is a great question. So I get this a lot. I put out my disclaimer. I don't have any pharma connection. I mean, I worked in pharma and biotech over a decade ago for a number of years. Basically half my career. But I don't now. I'm an academic, and so they say, I'm paid. They say I'm paid by big pharma. Totally not. I took a pay cut to come to academia, and it's I like what I do in academia, but it's so how do I deal with it? I started by I put my disclaimer on my on YouTube. I put a disclaimer on every one of my videos. And for a while, I was just answering everybody's question. It's, kind of wasting my time answering people's question. And literally, that's why I set up the Buy Me a Coffee thing. So I set up the Buy Me a Coffee thing so that I would have a stock answer, and I could say, no, I'm not being paid by Pharma, but if you like my work, you can buy me a coffee. And I just thought that felt a little better and a little less pissed off than arguing with them. So, oh man, so WH code. Well, reinfection rates. So, it's still early. I think I think there have been some studies on, reinfection from like the BA2, and Omicron is certainly, there's a lot of immune escape. That's how it's gotten into people who've been vaccinated and people who've been infected before. But if you're wondering about the direction of the pandemic for the next 6 to 9 months, what I would say is, the one thing that is definitely not true is people who are saying that this is just going to evolve into like an ongoing milder thing, like making this idea that somehow viruses evolved to some sort of mild that's just a misunderstanding of some pretty basic evolution. And there's no reason to think that. So we don't really know. I don't think anybody really knows. But what is needed, I think what's needed is going to be vaccine equity, because we don't really have, until we get enough inoculation in enough of the population, it's really hard for our expectations to settle down. And that's not, that's not based on my expertise at all. That's based on me listening to people who are real experts, and not pundits. Yes, and that's fair. I think, so, right, because when people say waning immunity, like I just did, it kind of puts a certain spin on it, unintentionally or not, and makes people think that it doesn't have value. And, that's, I think Vincent's right on that. Oh, man. They're really useful. So, I think if that conference had not published a collection of the abstracts in a volume of that journal, none of this would have happened. I mean, if you saw my discussion with Yakov, he had kind of forgotten about it. He's moved on with his life, right? And then he woke up and there's this massive explosion of interest, thousands and thousands of tweets. So, I think that maybe conference organizers can be a little careful about whether they want to publish the abstract books. There are conferences that publish proceedings, which are full papers from some selected presentations at a conference. And sometimes conferences will associate with journals so that people at the conference can have a fast track to a special issue of a journal that's devoted to the topics of the conference. But maybe in these polarized times, it's a less good idea for conferences to publish books of abstracts in journals where they get picked up by PubMed and other abstracting services. Henri, okay, what are my thoughts? Okay, I have so far resisted the temptation, and thank you, by the way, thanks. So far I've resisted the temptation to wade into the origins debate on YouTube, although I may change that. My prior on this has always been that it came from animals. And I think the evidence has definitely gone much, much more in that direction. In the last, certainly in the last few weeks, there have been 3 studies, 2 out of a collection of shared groups, and then 1 out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, or the Chinese CDC. And all of those, in collection, there's a lot of consilience, like different lines of evidence that kind of lean toward this, indicate the same thing. They're very consistent with each other. And that is that it came from animals. One of the reasons it's been really hard, I think, to get a lot of more direct evidence about that is that, SARS-1 came from animals. It came from wildlife trading. And starting 5, 6 years before the pandemic, the CCP under Xi had started an anti-poverty program to do a lot of wildlife trading and a lot of it was in regions like Hubei province, where Wuhan is located. So there's a lot of wildlife farming in that region. And there was also a big pork shortage in the fall of 2019. And pork prices increased, and so there was a lot of increased trade in wildlife. But then at the very, very start of the pandemic, all of that got shut down. They cleaned out all of the cages. They culled all of the animals. They shut down all the farms. And so, people who are on the lab leak side say, well, we don't, there's no direct evidence because we don't have an animal. But, the whole, there were about 500,000 animals by a good estimate being farmed, wildlife animals being farmed in the region around Wuhan in Hubei in 2019. 500,000 animals, and they were all culled. And so those farms have all been shut down, and you can't get samples from them. And while they found samples, environmental samples, in the cage regions where the wildlife was sold in the market, in the Huanan market, that's a little indirect. There are other lines of evidence that make it, that to me, really, really strongly favor the wildlife origin. One is that there are clearly two lineages, not just one, right, that trace right back to the very beginnings, to late 2019. And they both originate right in the region of the Huanan market. And that's just not. So the argument that, say, somebody walking out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is across the river and down further south, and then goes to the Huanan market and then starts a spreading event, okay, but that happening twice with two different lineages and starting a spreading event basically at the same location seems a lot less likely. So that's my view on it. Andy, I have no idea. I know people feel very strongly about this. It's just not something that I've kept up with, so I just don't know. I try to stay away from real clinical issues because it's not my thing. There are clinicians, so Dr. Yanyu is quite good on clinical issues, and I'm delighted when he weighs in. Okay, so Del, man, I hope your daughter is having a less rough time of it now than she did in 2020. So my view so I don't like the term natural immunity. There's vaccine-induced immunity and there's infection-induced immunity, and they're both real and they're both natural. So I know some people, including Dr. Campbell, made a big deal of of a particular paper, which seemed to show, depending on how you read it, certainly how he read it, it seemed to show that the infection-induced immunity, that there was no additional protection offered by vaccination after infection-induced immunity. There are lots of issues with that in making that direct comparison from the data, just the way it was done. But in addition, of course, the people who had infection-induced immunity and then were part of that study, they all lived, right? So it's removed all the people who were killed by their infection. And on that basis alone, it's unfair. So I don't think there's good evidence yet, at least I haven't seen any, that the vaccine-induced immunity is worse in broad measure than infection-induced immunity. And vaccine-induced immunity doesn't come with long COVID, right? So it doesn't come with all those other issues. So my view is it's still, I'm glad she's fully vaccinated and boosted. Sorry to hear that she has Omicron. I hope it goes well for her. And she'll be getting an additional boost from that, right? So she'll get some additional immunity from that. Oh, thank you, Andy. Yeah. So again, I don't know. There might be. It's just not. It's just not something that I've really followed. I certainly. So I guess my view is that vitamin D deficiency is bad, right? So if you're really deficient in vitamin D, then that's bad. There is, I think, some disagreement on how much vitamin D is sufficient. So there are disagreements on whether, like, the FDA recommendations are enough. So there's some disagreement on that. But it's another thing to say, if somebody is not deficient, would they benefit more from taking vitamin D supplementation? And on that, I'm inclined to think no. But it's not my area. So that's just like, my prior on that. Oh yeah, I liked it. So thank you for doing that. I like when people do that. That's there was one person who took a video of mine and took the whole thing and reposted it with subtitles in Spanish. And actually, I would have loved to utilize their subtitles, and kind of. And so I reached out, but there wasn't any way to contact them, so that wasn't so good. But most, if people find value in the videos, I wrote about, there was it's now on a Chinese site in China, and now I have Chinese subtitles as a trade, so that's great. Oh man, I'm glad you asked this question. No. So there's, the way that gets interpreted, actually that is, they did a sequence analysis, a sequence search, and when I teach at university, a lot of what I teach is bioinformatics, which is that area, or, it includes that area. And so what do I think of this Daily Mail title? I think that's really misleading, and it's the kind of thing that is just exploiting people's lack of expertise. So I had a discussion with some other scientists about this, and I actually decided that I'm going to use this, not the Daily Mail title, but I'm going to use the paper itself as an example of how to use the BLAST sequence search tool wrongly when I teach BLAST in the fall. I teach it every fall. In an introductory bioinformatics class. And I'm going to use that example as the wrong way to use BLAST because it's just terrible. The technical details of why it's terrible, probably not so appropriate for this. I'd need some audiovisual aids that I don't have at hand. But maybe I'll make a video on that for the class and I'll post it on the channel so that you can see how the example works. Yeah, this is true. So I'm in Singapore, where dengue is endemic. In fact, I got a message from a friend of mine who came down, who is just recovering from dengue. There's been quite a lot of it this year. It's mosquito-borne, so in Singapore we have a lot of clusters. There's a kind of a very tracking of mosquito areas. People can be fined for leaving out still water and allowing mosquitoes to breed on their property. So it's a big deal. People would love a dengue vaccine that addressed the different dengue types, 3 different dengue types. In the case of dengue, it's been very hard to develop a vaccine. The surface of the virus it's just been hard. It's hard to find epitopes that are well exposed and available. So I don't know whether this particular one has any regulatory issues that are particularly difficult. What I would say is that mRNA vaccines change everything. That's my view. So mRNA vaccines are such a major change. It's really exciting because at least the potential for developing better computer-designed vaccines, faster, dealing with variants, those types of issues. I think it's really, really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it rolls out. And I hope there are a lot more dengue vaccines. It would make a lot of difference to Singapore and certainly everywhere else in the region. So James, I have not read the book. I have ordered it, so I've got it from Amazon. So I've got a Kindle version from Amazon, but I've just been too busy to read it in full. I've started it. You know, what I have read. They do a lot of speculation about what other people are thinking or were thinking in February 2020 and so on. And what I don't see is a lot of I don't see a lot of real insight into the science. So in that respect, it's quite disappointing, and it's more it's very kind of breathless, the parts that I've read. But when I get a chance, I'll read it. I don't think the lab leak theory will hold up. I think it was certainly a legitimate thing. I think it is. Here's what I'll say about the lab leak theory. It's really interesting to me that it started from kind of two committed prior beliefs, at least in America, right? So politically, on the right, there were people who for political reasons, wanted to blame China for the virus, and this was, kind of a pretty clear path to blame China. So there was a lot of support in some elements of the right on that basis, but also on the far left, there's been a lot of concern about bioweapons. That's a good thing to be concerned about bioweapons. There's also been a lot of concern about dual-use biotechnology, the idea that you're going to have, bio labs that are doing, like weapons research under the guise of something else. And some of the folks on that have been just really, really adamant and really passionate, and I would say not very rational, at least in some of their scientific arguments. And it is super interesting to me that those two politically, like, kind of really at the edges of the American political polls, managed to become the strangest of bedfellows in the lab leak hypothesis. That is interesting. Tomo, so Active 6 has opened a high-dosage arm of ivermectin. So I don't know that suggests that. So I don't know enough about how the protocol, how the trial protocol was designed to, modify the arms. So they may have been designed like if they didn't see any signal to go up as long as the safety was okay. I just don't know enough about their trial design. I wish I knew the answer to that. I would say that I'm trying to do good, and then I'll push back, right? So what I would say is that misinformation spreads a lot faster and a lot easier. There are channels that try to do debunking, right? There are a number of channels that try to do debunking. And what I'm trying to do is, certainly there's some debunking. I want to push back on misinformation. But what I'm also trying to do is education. So I put out that video on like how to spot misinformation. I want to do some other videos on how to on strategies for basically combating misinformation and understanding how it spreads. Scientifically, there's a lot of research on that. I want to bring in people like Andrew Gelman to talk about, we talked about statistical issues in clinical trial design. I don't know if Andrew is one of the most highly cited scientists in the world. My own work has been cited a few thousand times, but when I linked to Andy's, Andrew. We've known each other since we were like 10. But when I linked to his Google Scholar profile, he has something like 145,000 citations. It's just crazy. He's another world. But he can talk really well. He can speak really well and with a great deal of authority to issues in statistical issues in clinical trial design that are often sources of misinformation. I'm hoping at some point in the future to have a discussion with the authors of The Misinformation Age. So I want to do education that kind of helps people not just like know whether a specific misinformation source is something to be aware of, but to kind of be more educated to avoid that kind of misinformation in the future. So that's my goal, and then I just kind of try to do it and see, maybe it's just a drop in the ocean. I don't know. Yeah, this is correct, James, right? So the mild to moderate infection doesn't, so you have a more consistent immunity with the vaccine. And when people talk about the contraction or the waning, often they're talking about just the antibodies, which is the infection protection. But, they're not, the protection against severe disease involves T cells, right? It involves other mechanisms besides just the initial antibody response. And the vaccines provide more consistent protection than, such a range of infections. So, Darren, okay, so let's ask what do I mean by natural? Vaccine-induced immunity is natural in the sense that it's invoking the natural systems that your body uses to develop and mature antibodies to prepare the T cell system, to basically prep your body, your immune system with the memory and the ability to combat an infection. In that sense, it's natural. If your argument is that it's not natural because the vaccine is not a product of nature, then I guess that's certainly a way to look at it. But in my case, in what I'm describing is the process by which that goes on in our bodies is a natural process to develop the protection that is offered by vaccination. Are people who've been boosted still susceptible to organ damage, increased risk of heart disease, long COVID, etc. from Omicron? Well, so they're not as susceptible to severe disease, right? So even though, there's an increased risk of, say, cardiovascular risks from infection, there's kind of a, I don't want to misuse this. Maybe there's kind of a dose response for the severity of the infection and the risk. But being protected from severe disease should provide a concomitant infection to the long-term effects of the severe disease, the severity of the infection. The severity of the infection is partly like how far the virus gets. But I think we don't, there's not enough known yet to answer this kind of question definitively. I think that in the model, my prior would be yes, they would be, but I think there's not enough known because the boosting, the 3x Pfizer or mRNA, Moderna, hasn't been widespread for that long. So there's not that long data on it. Ian, this is, oh my gosh. So it's not good, I guess. I mean, it's not good. So, and this is, it angers me because, yeah, it's not good. You don't need to like your doctor, but you do need to have faith in his or her regulated, it's basically their knowledge and ability to make decisions that affect your health and outlook. Yeah, you do. It's really important that you are able to do that. And, damage to trust is, in large measure, fueled by misinformation. So, grifters who want to put fear into people in order to, sell their remedies or, it's just, I think cynicism is like my least favorite human quality, but it's hard. I mean, but that type of grift is the most cynical thing, right? It's exploiting people's vulnerability in uncertain times. And it ultimately erodes trust in scholarship. It trusts in expertise. There's a great book by the author Tom Nichols, who's a war scholar, but this book is called The Death of Expertise. And I think there's a lot to that. It's not a happy read because of this, right? So, I will try. So I'll say this: I will try, as long as I'm doing this YouTube thing, not to get out of my lane, right? So if I don't have to have an opinion on everything. I try not to, people ask me to do videos on clinical things, and what I usually do, if it's a question that involves like, a clinical decision, a clinical thought process for patients and their doctors, I turn to Yanyu and I say, if you do this, it would be great. Maybe we could collaborate on it, something, it would be great. But that's not what I want to do. So I think the line between kind of somebody who wants to help with their expertise, which is, generally good, and somebody who becomes a pundit is when they decide that the world needs to hear their opinion on everything. Okay, Sean, I'm so glad you asked. I may or may not make a video about this. The Pfizer documents are, I saw Dr. Campbell's video, I saw a couple of other videos, and it is maddening to me that they're misusing this so cynically and so badly. Okay. When you develop a drug, so if you're a company developing a drug, okay, sure, they want to make money, right? But they also have, they're people, they have families, they genuinely want a drug that works. And the drug companies go through a huge amount to work through the safety of drugs before they get into the clinic. They do all these safety studies and toxicology studies on animals. Then they do the phase 1 studies, which are really entirely safety, before they go to phase 2, which is safety and efficacy, and phase 3 for large-scale efficacy. And I want to address your question by first mentioning the VAERS system, VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. For the mRNA vaccines, VAERS has many more reports for the mRNA vaccines than for previous vaccines. And people look at those reports and they say, oh, this is terrible. But there was actually a change in the law. By law, VAERS doctors, medical professionals are only required, it's a voluntary system, and they're basically asked to report when the event appears linked to the virus, to the vaccine, excuse me. When the event appears linked to the vaccine. When they did the emergency use authorization for the mRNA vaccines, it became a legal mandate for medical professionals to report every incident, no matter what, no matter whether it had any relation or it likely bore any relation to the vaccine. So of course there's going to be more incidents. The reason you collect all that data is to understand what issues there are, right? So it's by actually looking through that data, then you can find that, yes, there is elevated myocarditis. And it is in younger men more than other age groups. But you also find that there aren't elevated events. There's not elevated pericarditis. So there's lots of reports of pericarditis, but there's people have pericarditis. So it's not linked to the vaccine. It's just that you have hundreds of millions of people taking the vaccine, and doctors are required to report every single event in order for the data analysis to eventually identify whether there are any actual adverse events. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Pfizer documents? When a company releases a drug or a treatment, a novel drug or treatment especially, they would rather not somebody else tell them that there's a problem. Right? They want to know first if there's a problem. They want to be able to stay on top of it, address the issues, change the whatever needs to be changed in order to address it. Partly, of course, for financial reasons. They want to be able to keep their drug on the market. But the way to do that is not to give it to people who shouldn't get it. The way to do that is to understand who shouldn't get it or how it needs to be modified, and then address that. So Pfizer highlighted a bunch of things that they wanted to track, basically to kind of cover everything that might happen with the virus. With the vaccine, everything that might happen with the vaccine. And so they have this whole list of things, basically areas of concern. Maybe they've seen these for other vaccines. Maybe there's just things that they think, mechanistically might be things good to look at. But basically, it's just fishing for information to see if they can see signs of issues. And what it doesn't, I think in Dr. Campbell's video, he says we don't know how many people have been vaccinated, so we don't know the denominator, and we can't do the math. But I think that's reasonable, because if you did the math, you'd get a misleading result. You'd get some sort of rate of events that people would share as a rate of adverse events when it's nothing like that, because the causal link hasn't been established. So I think it's a tool for misuse, or it's easily misused, easily misrepresented. And I think Dr. Campbell's video on the Pfizer documents was certainly, they're complicated, and so maybe he just didn't understand it. But I would say increasingly his misunderstandings seem to lean in one direction, and so, make of that what you will. I am behind on this. I apologize. I've been taking a lot longer to. Dengue is painful. If you know anybody who's gotten it, it is not fine. I have thought about this. Believe me, I have. I'm busy, but I have thought about that. So Darren, what I would say is that, it's really important that stuff be tracked, right? We know that there's higher rates of myocarditis. There are also much higher rates of myocarditis for people who get the virus. And myocarditis typical myocarditis from a viral infection, viral myocarditis, is a big deal. Like 6% of, I think it's 6% of that same age group, the young, who get viral myocarditis, I hope I'm coming with that. I think it's that. I think it's 6%. Ultimately would require a transplant. That's a lot, right? It's something. It's a serious thing. It's a long-term serious thing. The myocarditis from vaccines, generally from the vaccines, it's elevated, but it seems to be a sort of qualitatively different myocarditis. That is to say, it resolves quickly, just on its own or with aspirin. And so it's qualitatively different. So just the rate of incidence is not fair, and a lot more needs to be understood about it. Now it may be, so I don't know. It may be that there would be issues, but the thing is I'm sorry for your loss. Honestly. I know enough people who've lost their lives or lost the lives of friends and family members from the virus. So was it vaccine induced? So that's why those studies are done, because anecdotally, everybody thinks it's going to be vaccine induced if it comes, soon after the vaccine. And that's why the larger studies are needed. That's why the comparisons are needed to make sense of it. Okay, this is where we get to the limits of my understanding of immunology. So I don't know, but I also think that this is kind of ripe for misinterpretation, and I'm not going to kind of try to weigh in on something that I don't think I could adequately explain. There's a lot of research on long COVID. I've certainly seen quite some really concerning papers on neural effects, so CNS effects, neurological damage, elevated cardiovascular risk of just an amazing variety. So it's not just myocarditis, it's a really wide range of elevated cardiovascular risk from infection. And I think the elevated risk has to be considered something kind of long COVID-ish. But there's so much going on, and I haven't paid as much attention to it as I would like. I have a number of PDFs in my to-read to kind of, if I eventually make a video in this area. But for this, what I would say is I would recommend looking to TWIV, This Week in Virology, because they're really, really good on this, especially their their clinical updates are often more kind of short-term, kind of what's happening now. But they often talk about studies related to long COVID. Oh, man. Big uproar over the reverse transcription of BNT162b2 in human cells, paper about a month ago. That paper is so terrible. It's really hard to, it's just maddening. And of course, that's the kind of thing that no matter how weak a paper it is, no matter how marginal a paper it is, no matter how limited the findings are, it gets picked up in this selective sharing and amplified to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. In this case, they never showed that the DNA was really in the nucleus. They never showed that it integrated. They didn't even try to show that it was integrated. They never showed that anything except a very short region had some reverse transcription. The cells that they used are cancer cells, which have elevated line 1 protein, which is the protein that has the reverse transcriptase activity. And they didn't try another cell line. It's just so limited, and I don't think it deserves paying attention to. Dr. Susan Oliver on Back to the Science, she did a video about that study, and I think her video covered a lot of the limitations. But of course, her video will be seen by, a few thousand people, whereas Dr. Mobeen's 3 videos on the same topic will probably be seen by 500,000 people, and he's making a huge deal out of it. So it's really exhausting, honestly. I don't know. There's actually, there's a lot of interest in nasally administered vaccines or, nasally administered medicines for respiratory diseases, but I don't know of anything that provides a comparison along the lines that you're asking. This would be much more of a question for a virologist than for somebody like myself. So, okay. So obesity is certainly a risk factor. So I want to address that. This isn't a question for me, but I could see the kind of back and forth going in the comments. So obesity is certainly a risk factor. Diabetes is certainly a risk factor and often associated with obesity. Avoiding or, just not addressing this question here, just the general question of obesity. Obesity is certainly a risk factor for COVID, for severe disease. Not a risk factor for infection, but it's a risk factor for the severity of the disease. But the thing is, there's a lot of disingenuous stuff out there about this, because people are saying, well, let's not get vaccinated, let's everybody just go on a diet. I mean, I'm being oversimplifying, but we're not going to jog our way to we're not going to jog our way out of the pandemic. We're going to vaccinate our way out of the pandemic more than anything else. It's the most important thing. Okay, so I'm in Singapore. I think Singapore has handled it really pretty well, except for the contact tracing. And when I say except for the contact tracing, I think they did too much of it, or I think they're keeping it too long. So I would like to see the contact tracing. It's been good. It's been helpful, I think. But at this stage, when we move into endemicity, then I think it's probably not necessary the way we do it. We have to basically scan a QR code in order to enter a shopping mall. And I don't think that's that. I hope that's not permanent. But Singapore's done a really great job in a lot of ways. Certainly made mistakes, like everybody. I think they underestimated the risk to the migrant worker population. And they live in very close quarters, and the migrant workers have had and still are having a very difficult time in Singapore and in many other countries with high populations of migrant workers. I think Taiwan has handled it well. New Zealand obviously has handled it extremely well. I think, for example, Sweden did not handle it well, certainly at the beginning. And there are direct comparisons of, say, Sweden and Denmark. Denmark has handled it really quite well. And if you look at the early stages, that's one of the best examples of the benefits of the non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing and lockdowns, because Sweden did relatively little, Denmark did a lot, and Sweden lost a lot more people at that stage when the comparison is relevant. So I think Denmark did quite well. They've had a lot of deaths recently if they've opened up and so on, but I think they did well. No. Well, there's no basis for it. There's certainly no basis for it. No. Yeah, this is a misunderstanding of how evolution works, actually. So no, there's no basis for this at all. It's weird to see how this has come up. I mean, I actually I've been bewildered by this argument being gaining the strength that it has among primarily among anti-vaccine folks. So, Carrie, vaccines work really, really well. So in Singapore, we have very high levels of vaccinated. Obviously, when you have a very high level of vaccinated, you're going to get, ultimately, if 100% of people are fully vaccinated, then everybody who gets sick is vaccinated. And then you can't make that comparison without also adjusting for the rates of vaccination. But Singapore tracks the number of deaths, the number of hospitalized, the number in ICU, and posts numbers by vaccination status. And it is overwhelmingly clear that vaccinations have provided outstanding protection for people against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And I would say, in terms of tracking, Singapore does it as well as anybody. Yeah, this is true. A lot of people do not understand how the VAERS system works, and in particular, that the rules of VAERS reporting are different for the mRNA vaccines than they are for previous vaccines because of the pandemic, because of the emergency use authorization. There's a legal requirement for reporting by health professionals that simply doesn't exist for other vaccines, and so the reporting is much higher. Yeah, I hope that doesn't come to pass more than it is, but it seems to be moving in that direction. Well, okay, so the contract, so there's a legal requirement for this, and so are you arguing, if you're arguing that nowhere near all events have been reported, much more have been reported because of those requirements than for previous vaccines. So one gets a much more complete picture of events that may or may not be related to vaccines from the mRNA vaccines than at previous points in vaccine history. And vaccines have historically been extremely safe. So Is it going to be 100%? No. But it will be much greater than 100% in some ways, right? So will it be 100% of all events that actually are related to the vaccine? Probably not, because you never get 100%. But it'll be, a very large percentage, maybe 90% of a whole bunch of events that aren't actually caused by the vaccine. So in that respect, it's much overreported. Hey, Zachary. It is, drug companies are hated, right? By many people, right? And they're thought to be just terrible profit mongers. And so it's they're in some respects, they're in a tough position, because any argument they might make to try to keep misleading interpretations of their data in check would be seen as some sort of malevolent protection of their interests. It could be a malevolent protection of their interests, right? So, nobody's pure. But if it's not, it would certainly be interpreted that way. So then we're stuck. We're all stuck. So have I asked John Campbell to do a so I've emailed him several times. I initially emailed him in November. I posted my entire email in the community tab of my channel. And I've emailed him several times since on a number of different topics, and he has never replied. So I've certainly offered to have a discussion with him. In fact, a few weeks ago, one of his viewers who also watches my videos reached out to both of us, basically emailed both of us, and said, I'd love you guys to have a conversation or a debate or something. And I replied twice. I replied once and said immediately, yeah, sure, I'd be open for it. And then I replied a week later and said, is there any follow-up? But so far, Dr. Campbell hasn't responded at all. I guess at this point I'm not expecting to, because he's made a few very caustic comments about people who have called him out on his videos, and his interpretation seems to be that people, and I don't know if he's talking about me, right? So there are other people who've called him out as well. So I don't know if he's talking about me, but whoever he's talking about, he's saying that they're doing it basically just to increase their viewership and trade off his name. I can tell you personally, I would be delighted to stop making videos about John Campbell. Oh my goodness, I would be happy for that. But in order for me to do that, he's going to have to not do as much misinformation. How exhausting do I find it? I find it exhausting, for sure. In part because, again, I don't see what I'm doing as just kind of wagging a finger at people, right? So I don't see what I'm doing as just saying, you're wrong. Because, first off, there are other YouTube channels that do that. But the other reason is because I think that while I think there's a role for that, my sense is that there's also a limitation that I don't want to share. What I do also has its own limitations. But there's a limitation because what you end up doing is getting people who already agree with you to go, yeah, and so they have an idea that maybe it aids them in the arguments that they're having with their friends and family, I guess. But it doesn't really change anybody's mind, right? So I got into this. I did my first video because about a year ago in October or November, a friend of mine started messaging me about ivermectin and about vaccines. So she was very concerned about the vaccines. She was very interested in ivermectin. I think she may have also been interested in hydroxychloroquine at the time. She was very interested in those things. She was following Pierre Corey and the FLCCC. And she asked me to help her understand those issues. And I decided at that point that I wasn't just going to say, they're full of crap. I decided at that point I was just going to learn everything that I could about what she was seeing and hearing, and I would just engage in a conversation with her. I've known her for many, many years. And then so I did that. And we had this conversation largely over WhatsApp, especially after lockdown in April of 2021. So she was eligible, April of 2020, excuse me. So April of 20, it was basically locked down from April of 2020, and then, we've had restrictions ever since. So it was largely over WhatsApp. She was eligible for her vaccine probably in April or May of 2021, as was I. But she didn't get vaccinated until September. She didn't get her first dose until September. And we had kept that conversation going the whole time, so almost a year. And then she got her second dose in October. And then in November, she invited me to dinner, and I finally met her husband and her daughter. And I didn't know if her husband was of like mind. So I didn't know where he was on all of this. And I met him at the front door, and he shook my hand, and he said, and I'm not making this up, he said, I won't use her name. But he said, I want to thank you for saving my wife's life and probably our marriage. That's what he said to me. And I was really shook. And then, and she confirmed it. Now, I don't know if it was that serious, but I mean, it was, they were not on the same page. And so we had a lovely dinner. I went home. And then 2 days later, she messaged me with Dr. Campbell's video on the new Pfizer antiviral and ivermectin. And I made my first short because I was really frustrated. I saw Dr. Campbell's video and the misinformation that he had. And I got out my phone and made my first YouTube short, and I was really angry, and I just said, should I do anything about this? I was just sort of talking into the ether. And I posted the short, and then within hours I got thousands of comments, or at least hundreds of comments, many of them really angry. Like, who the hell are you? Leave Dr. Campbell alone. All this stuff. And it was really angry. Of course, I was angry when I made my short. So that's fair. I was frustrated. But then that's what led me to make my first video, my first misinformation video. And because I thought, one has to have this conversation, it has to be patient, it has to be open, it has to be respectful, despite the frustration in my short video. And so what I don't want to do is just be kind of talking to people who are already all on this. I want to do some education at the same time about how misinformation happens, about how you might be an unwitting victim and then become an unwitting contributor. So people can get themselves out of that. That's a very long answer to your question. Hammertooth says, and wow, I'm sorry I missed this earlier. Not to be that guy, but could you read the questions aloud for us audio only, folks? Love your videos, by the way. Keep it up. Thank you. Sorry, my first time doing this. I don't know what I'm doing. But I'll do that from now on. So for DMC1, I'd rather, I think I'd like to do that in another one, because I can tell you that is a topic on which I would probably spend 10 or 15 minutes, and I don't think that would be a good use of my first live stream. So maybe next time. Am I aware of Peter Doshi's statements, articles on access to raw trial data? So I think Doshi has been a disappointment, and I think he's taken the BMJ in a bad. I think some of the stuff that he's advocated has contributed to mistrust and misinformation. And I think the Paul Thacker article in the BMJ was particularly unhelpful, but some of Doshi's statements have been unhelpful. I think he's kind of somehow he's yeah. I'm not a fan. So I would say that open access of individualized patient data to understand how trials are designed and to understand trial authenticity is important. There are some things that are basically that might be from a trial that are, for example, if a pharma company designs a trial, they may want to monitor a whole bunch of things that they might have reasons to monitor or want to understand, but that are also not directly related to the outcomes and might be easily misused and misinterpreted. That's true for investigator-led trials too. So, I definitely think individual patient data in general should be available for meta-analysis, for example. So Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz and Jack Lawrence, Kyle Sheldrick, and that group had a really great article on this, and I think it's really important. But there are some of the specifics in Doshi's views on this that I think lend themselves to misinterpretation and misuse. So this is so this will get us into kind of the weeds of immunology, and I'm afraid that I'm going to, just as time is going, God, goodness gracious, it's 10:45 here, so I think I'd like to finish by 11. So I think this would not be wise for me. Sorry about that. Could you discuss, so I'll read the question. Sorry, I didn't read the question earlier. Could you discuss how the change of antigenic determinants is causing ADE and how that makes infection from this kind of virus severe? Maybe I'll hold that for a future video or live stream, if you don't mind. Claire, hi, nice to see you. Hi there from the Northern Hemisphere. We're in the Northern Hemisphere here in Singapore, only barely. It's 1 degree north. So hi there from the Northern Hemisphere. Is anyone else becoming concerned about Campbell's frequent videos alluding to vaccine injury? I sure am. I think he's become increasingly like the kind of thing that he spoke out against a year ago, or a little more than a year ago. It's very concerning. He's misrepresenting vaccine injury data. He's relying on a combination of anecdotes and exaggeration, and it is really, really unfortunate, especially with a person of his influence. Yeah, not good, I think. So this is from WHO. This is Singapore related. It's hard for the government to give up its trace together powers. Disappointed face. Yeah, so it is. It's very hard for any government to give up its powers once they've taken them. So yeah, that's a concern. I was one of the people who said the trace together was. I was actually interviewed on the BBC. and said I didn't think the risk of trace together was the privacy risk of trace together, which is the tracking system. I didn't think the privacy risk of trace together was a concern. And then a few months later, they said, well, we will, if we need to use it for a criminal case, we will. So I was fooled, or I think they were fooled too. I don't think they anticipated it, but it goes to your point. Once you have that opportunity, they don't want to say no to that because it seems like something that they feel that they should have the ability to do. It's very natural, but it's disconcerting. Stephen Hope, is there any new data on long COVID from Omicron? I haven't seen anything on long COVID from Omicron itself. What I would say is that people who say that Omicron is much less severe than previous variants, I don't think that there's much support for that. Or I think it's really hard to quantify that because there's been so much vaccination by the time Omicron came about, and there's all the reinfection because of the immune escape. And so the combination is you're getting all these infections of people who've had some prior immunity, either from a vaccine or from a previous infection. And so they're not going to have a severe disease. And then you have all these people who are vaccinated, and so it's really hard to just isolate the people who've had no prior immunity to make a comparison as to the severity of the disease. But I don't know of any data on long COVID from Omicron. I think Omicron is generally not, only a subset of people are known to have Omicron because they don't test every person for the subtype. They just have sampling that gives a percentage of the different subtypes at any given time. So I think I mentioned, so Stephen asks, also, do we have any data on transmission outside, i.e. are masks necessary outside? So that's a policy issue, and I'm a scientist, so it's not sort of my area. But there are, I mentioned at the beginning, there are a bunch of recent papers that keep confirming the benefits of masks, and when I have a chance to read the details of those papers, hopefully I'll be able to form some opinion on that topic. As I said, I do not see myself stepping into a subway or a bus without a mask for a long time. So there definitely, I imagine myself kind of carrying a mask forever, whether I'm wearing it or not. Sean Brantley says, even if I don't agree with all your points, you're an excellent scientific communicator. I've got to go, but I hope to see more of your Q&As in the future. Well, thank you very much. Hope to see you there too. James Knight says, Yakov Efemenko, the first author of the recent the abstract, said he contacted him, I think John Campbell, so we'll see if that materializes into anything. I imagine not, though. So, if you've seen anything of the back and forth on Twitter, which is amazing, if I were Yakov, I would be extremely wary of being used for gaslighting by any of the people who've misrepresented his work. If I were advising him, I would say protect yourself. Don't let these folks take advantage of you again. Rain Puppy asks, is it true that the vaccines change the form of some COVID-related genes in our bodies? No. No. That's not what they do. They just get turned into protein, and then that protein gets represented on the surface of cells and is used to develop basically used to be recognized by your immune system and retain a memory of that development. WH Co asks, is it likely that a fourth dose of our current mRNA vaccines to be approved soon? Do you think a fourth dose would even be helpful compared to taking a newer, more tailored vaccine? So I don't know. I follow, one of the reasons I follow TWIV, This Week in Virology, because they're really good and they're specialists in exactly this type of conversation in a way that I am not. So I listen to them for this, and then follow the scientific papers that I've read and the basically the same stuff everybody's following. So there's increasing data in Israel. I think I think the jury's still out on exactly how this is going to go. I would say the mRNA vaccines are developing really rapidly. The technology is remarkable and it's exciting. I've done a fair amount of work dealing with RNA, other aspects of RNA. I did my PhD was on aspects of RNA biophysical chemistry stuff or biophysics. So I sort of follow this area, and I think it's really really interesting technology. But in terms of those types of stuff, that for this you'd need an immunologist you'd need an immunologist to really discuss this. Doughyhead says, Professor Greg, please don't call Campbell's videos misinformation anymore. It is clear disinformation at this point. So I think sometimes, so I would say the excess deaths misrepresentation of the ONS data, I would say, was disinformation. I don't think it's always disinformation. It's, I'd like to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I know some people think I'm a meanie, but it's not. That's not how I work. And in this case, I refer to him as Dr. Campbell. Some people use pejoratives or dismiss his PhD. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't want to go down that road. There are people who. So I've posted a lot of videos at this point on ivermectin. I think it's a bad idea. I don't think the evidence supports it at all. But I have not and will never call ivermectin horse paste, because that's not. I think that's totally unhelpful. You have to. It's a drug. It's a drug that people use. The argument against ivermectin is not that you're not a horse. The argument against ivermectin is that SARS-CoV-2 is not a parasite. So in this case, I'll try to make a decision in each case. If I have the misfortune of responding to more of Dr. Campbell's videos, I'll try to make a decision in each case as to how to call it. KM, I have no idea if this is for me. You haven't acknowledged the studies and evidence, so it's hard to find a starting place. Don't you find it unusual so many studies removed? Yes, you come across as wagging a finger. I'm not sure what you're referring to. But if you can rephrase it. Okay. So what about it that was cringy? I mean, he had his abstract at a meeting taken and blown up and taken entirely out of context and misrepresented to millions of people. It's totally unfair to him, and people didn't listen to him or his co-author when they said the study was being misrepresented. And I thought he deserved to have a voice because, tens of thousands of people were misrepresenting his work. Sorry you thought it was cringy and a pony show. I guess that's the way it goes. So Claire says Singapore sounds like such a nice like a nice place. Any place that takes littering seriously is my kind of place. It's a pet peeve of mine. So I will tell you, the actual first day I set foot in Singapore, I knew nothing about Singapore except that you couldn't chew gum and you couldn't litter. And we were walking our baby girl in a stroller down the street from the hotel, and eventually I wanted to look at a bus stop and see if I could figure out the bus routes. And so I went over to the sign for the bus routes, and I stepped in gum that somebody had spat on the sidewalk. It's the only time it's ever happened in 17 years, and I'm the only person I know that it's ever happened to. But it happened to me on the very first day I was in Singapore, and so my cab driver said I should play 4D, which is the lottery, because he thought it was lucky. So Doyhead asks, why do you think we aren't getting a new vaccine as opposed to a booster shot? Vaccines are tough to develop, and the vaccines have been very, very effective. I think so. There are some new vaccines that are coming on the market, but they're getting approved in different places at different rates. And I think for people who are getting an additional shot, the general expectation had been get the same one until they did some studies that suggested that maybe a little mix and match might be an improvement. So I think there'll be more vaccines as we go forward for sure. Not just for COVID, but for lots of things. I think I'm really optimistic about that. But right now where we are, the booster shots are becoming available faster than new vaccines. Peer on Download says, I think long COVID should have been called, quote, post-viral symptom up to and including permanent damage. Yeah. So there was, that's good. There was this study. There's a lot of data that COVID infection has, leads to sexual dysfunction. It leads to a lot of sexual health issues. So long COVID is associated with some of those issues. In fact, that's one of the studies that Yakov had been involved in. And a couple of weeks ago, a group at Northwestern did just a really interesting, technically difficult, demanding study using PET, positron emission tomography, to look at the distribution of the virus, the virus when there's infection in rhesus macaques, monkeys. And they did that imaging, and they found that it went into the penis and the testes of the monkey, and then they did a postmortem dissection, and the virus infects the genital tract, it's really something. This is the virus really gets around, and in terms of long COVID, when I read that study, I thought, well, if there's one thing that Joe Rogan could discuss that might convince some of his audience to get vaccinated, that would be it. Question, F Booth 90, do you play the mandolin? Yes, I do. I play the mandolin, the guitar, you see the guitar there, and I also play, my main instrument is the dobro, or the lap steel, so I play a slide guitar. So sometimes the dobro is where the guitar is, but today it's the guitar. Yes. Have there been any non-COVID related issues in biotech that have captured your attention lately? Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in biomarkers. There's a lot of biomarkers of cancer. There's a lot of genomics. So I follow a lot of genomics. There's a lot of new developments in genomic technology that I follow pretty closely. There are a whole bunch of issues, and if I was not originally planning to, for the channel to turn in this direction, and I still will be making more technical videos about topics in science from time to time. But right now, this is where we are. James Knight says, totally agree. I think the media calling ivermectin horse paste was such a glaringly stupid thing to do. Absolutely. Just really, it was so obviously going to backfire. I'm vaxxed. Rain Puppy asks, I'm vaxxed. Should I be concerned about the long-term effects of COVID-19 anyway? So, when I listen to TWIV and their clinical updates and so on, I feel reassured about this myself. And I'm not a clinician, so I listen to TWIV and their clinical updates. So my sense is that, probably not, but time will tell. My health obs asks, great question. Do we think a lot of this disinformation is coordinated from somewhere? I do. Some of it is. So, a lot of the ivermectin stuff in particular is. So the IVM Metasite is clearly run by the folks behind FLCCC, but they don't own it, right? So it's an anonymous site. So there is a lot of coordination. So it's also true there's Trial Site News, which is very linked up with them. How did all these people land on the same meeting abstract a few days and amplify it to millions of people? They're following the same, Twitter sources. Somebody picks up on it, suddenly it gets repeated everywhere. So I don't know if it's intentionally coordinated, but these networks are connected, right? They're people who are connected and influencing each other. PRN download. Can you address the potential worst-case scenario unfolding for a virus of this type? Well, SARS-1 was worse. It was worse in terms of mortality. MERS was worse, is worse, because MERS still exists, in terms of mortality. And there is a lot of encroachment of humans on wildlife areas. These bats, horseshoe bats, and the many, many viruses that they carry are all over the place in Asia. And as humans encroach on those areas, it's, there's a lot of risk. I mean, that's why a lot of these bioresearch places exist, is to try to understand that risk. That's what EcoHealth Alliance does, is to try to protect against that. And a lot of the rationale for that sort of ecological, environmental or ecological health is because of what was learned from SARS-1. So to me, the most awful thing about the lab leak argument is that somehow people want to turn away from the type of research that is most likely to prepare us for the next pandemic. So I've looked at that some. I've certainly looked at the recent Pfizer documents that get a lot of discussion certainly on anti-vax sites, but also on places like John Campbell's channel. And I think those types of things are just so easy to misrepresent and have been misrepresented. So it's not always the case, I think, that more transparency is better. It should be better. Right? So it totally should be better. I remember Tim Berners-Lee was talking about the semantic web is just everything is connected, and sort of knowledge kind of would just kind of everybody would be practically omniscient. But I think science works and people work in much more it's more fractal. People work in local communities and they work efficiently in local communities. And so sometimes when you have transparency for all kinds of good reasons, it becomes weaponized. And when it becomes weaponized, it causes so much damage so quickly that I don't even know where to start about what happens there. It's really hard to know what a solution is for all of that stuff. By the way, I'll post this whole chat as a video. Oh, I saw your question. Hassan asked this question on Twitter. And so, hi, Hassan. Your videos are super helpful. Why have abstracts about associations if they can be misled? How is the association useful when talking about mortality rates? Surely just do RTC. You have to think, okay, these meetings happen, we send graduate students to a meeting, and it's like really exciting for them. They get to go to a meeting, participate in a meeting. I remember my first meetings participating. It was just fantastic, and I was talking with people I admired and going to posters and looking through posters and asking questions and learning a lot and criticizing and seeing weaknesses. It's just great. But it's meant to be, a discussion and a learning experience, and it's often a place where people can refine their early work and then make decisions about whether to take that work forward into a paper or not. But what is an abstract? An abstract at a meeting is a couple of paragraphs, maybe one paragraph, and to the extent that it's peer-reviewed, the whole decision about what to do with that at the conference is made on the basis of the abstract. So there's no paper unless the conference explicitly is publishing proceedings, then there might be a paper associated with it. But if that's not happening, there's no paper. Then they make a decision about whether the abstracts are accepted usually most conferences accept, a lot of abstracts because they want a lot of people at their meetings. Then some of those abstracts become posters, some of them become talks. So what I do is I go to a conference, I look at the schedule of talks, I circle the ones I want to attend. I look through the whole list of posters. So the posters are in, a big conference room and they're put up on boards. And they have more information than the abstract. So the poster might be, big. Big sheet of paper, and it's just like, or a big poster board, and it's got a lot of stuff on it, and the abstract is just a piece of it. So people might be giving talks. A long talk might be 20 minutes. A short talk might be 10 minutes. And then these posters are happening. They're dedicated poster sessions with coffee and refreshments that people wander around. And you kind of plan your time to visit the posters you want to visit and see the talks you want to see, talk with the people you want to talk with. And if you're giving a poster or a talk, you have to, of course, do that part too. And it's great. They're really, really interesting. They're great learning experiences for students. It's a great learning experience for a student to write up a poster and present a poster, even if it's weak and flawed. I think the mistake is for conferences to publish a book of abstracts. So I think that's the mistake. I don't think it's the mistake of the researchers, but I think in retrospect, the real problem, the switch that was thrown was when the conference published a book of abstracts, and then it's just that gets instantly weaponized. Lots of types of research need to be done, and a lot of it is kind of working through a process and learning as you go. So that's how I see it. Poopbot asks an important question. RE, the Pfizer clinical study whistleblower in the BMJ, do the claims question the accuracy or quality of the clinical trial, and how accurate is post-marketing surveillance to determine safety? Okay, so 2 questions. Do the claims question the accuracy or quality of the clinical trial? In my view, no. They do. So it was one, so they had, basically contractors, some companies working, and there was one company working with with some sites, and this was some observations at one site. If you actually look at the details, if it had an effect, and you kind of think rationally about the way the trial was set up and what the mistakes were, it probably would have made the vaccine look a little worse than it actually is. But it's also just, it was only observed at one site. Paul Thacker, the author of that article, made insinuations about other sites and insinuations about... It was just a smear article, I think. Now the question is, how accurate is post-marketing surveillance to determine safety? I can tell you from personal experience, from a long time ago, but it's still relevant. Pharma companies take it really, really seriously. They really do not want to put out something on the market and then find out that it has safety issues. Just think of the PR, right? They don't want that, right? So they want to be able to know first. They don't want somebody else to tell them that there are safety issues. They work. It's actually really that type of pharmacovigilance is a serious matter. They take it seriously. So any thoughts on sotrovimab causing mutations to the COVID Delta variant? Will other drugs such as molnupiravir help COVID mutations? So so personally, I am not overwhelmed with the molnupiravir clinical trial data. So I don't think, I'm not personally, I didn't make, I don't have anything, but so my personal view is that I don't think it really should have been approved, but not because of the mutational things that people talk about, not because it's a nucleotide analog. I just don't think the data was very strong, and it got and the initial data was stronger than the later data. So that would be my concern. I don't think that the mutation issues are likely to be a real thing. So this is totally on a different topic. Wei Kang Chua asks, do you think it's possible or plausible to slow down or undo the effects of aging and extend health span and lifespan? Have you heard of the TAME trial, Sense Research Foundation? So I know there's a lot going on this. There's a new institute that just plucked a bunch of academics out of big universities a couple of months ago. I'm not familiar with that particular trial. I mean, I do think there's a lot to do for health span, for sure. And I think if you're on Twitter, it's really interesting to follow Charles Brenner, who discovered the nicotinamide riboside mechanisms for NAD. And he's had a long-running disagreement with David Sinclair at Harvard, who has had a huge influence in resveratrol and the sirtuins. And just following that is really, really interesting. Scientifically, I'm more in the Charles Brenner camp than I am in the David Sinclair camp. But maybe that's good for another talk or another video. So FJM Radio asks, I understand you're based in Singapore. What's the pandemic like over here? Well, we still can't go to meals with large groups. There's still social distancing everywhere. We had lockdown twice, but they didn't call it lockdown. They called it circuit breaker. But it was basically a lockdown the way the rest of the world sees lockdowns. And we're still wearing masks everywhere, and I expect that will continue for a while. And I haven't played a gig since St. Patrick's Day 2020. I played a street festival, St. Patrick's Day 2020. But later this month I have a gig, but I don't know if there'll be much of a live audience. So you still can't play live music in restaurants. All right, I think I should just about wrap up. Let me see if I get any more here. Down at the bottom. Take one or two more. No, I think we're about there at the end. Okay, thank you all. So I just decided this basically at the last minute because I thought, hey, all these people are asking about different questions, and there's been a lot going on in the last 2 days. And Dr. Mobeen and I got into it a little bit on Twitter this morning because he pulled his video on the Miami study and then had a video or had a live stream this morning, Singapore time, about why he sort of blaming the authors for his video. Or, he took some responsibility for his video, but he also not full. And so I thought, hey, I'll just pop on this live stream and see if the tech works, and it sort of works. So yeah, thanks so much. There is actually, I do want to just get this one last question from Poopbot. Have you seen Mirror Genomics videos on? We discussed the latest. Yeah, so I haven't seen that particular video. But that Mirror Genomics guy has been moving in a particular direction, and I don't know. I'm sort of trying to keep my trying to develop an understanding of where he's coming from. I think some of the, we discussed the latest publication of a report showing that the spike protein can circulate for a prolonged, there's a lot of spike protein theorists out there. I think that's mostly misinformation, but maybe it's just misunderstandings. Anyway, thanks so much for dropping by. And great. I think I should close now. So thanks. I'll take my last drink. And see you next time. Let me know what kinds of things you'd like to see, and I will. I'll definitely put this up as a video as soon as, I don't know what'll happen at the end of this, but I guess I'll do that. Okay. See ya. Stay safe.